The CNBC app. Global market news in one place. Customizable sections and personalized alerts. Stocks tracking, interactive charts and market insights all in your hands. Stay connected. Stay informed. Download the CNBC app today.
Very warm welcome to Squawk Box. Different times around the world. It's Tuesday evening in San Francisco. Wednesday morning here in Europe. There you go, I got it right. I'm Steve Sedgwick with Karen Cho, and these are your headlines. China's economy grows faster than expected in the first quarter, but President Trump's tariffs fueling calls for further stimulus as officials look to meet their ambitious growth goals. ASML net bookings fall short of expectations. The chip equipment maker warning of increased demand uncertainty after, yes, you guessed it, President Trump's tariff announcements. The president himself ordering, yes, here we go again, a tariff investigation into critical minerals, potentially opening a new front in his global trade war. Nvidia warns it will book a record quarterly charge of $5.5 billion tied to GPU chip exports to China, sending shares lower in extended trade.
Let's take a look at the market action. The tariff threat still looming. Semi-conductors, pharma, now critical minerals as well. So the market, as you can see stateside, in reverse yesterday, a slightly lower tone as we saw red just creeping back onto these charts after a couple of days of moving to the upside. In terms of the big moving stocks, Caterpillar, again, right at the forefront of some of the cyclical action. And as we talk about resources, caught up in that. The Amazon trade, that was a weaker one, and that helped undermine some of the fortunes of the major boards. What we're seeing in terms of those US banks, it has been reporting season for the banks, and the message loud and clear that some of the volatility on markets has been good news for quarters of Wall Street. And this was the performance yesterday of those stocks. JP Morgan a little bit weaker, but Goldman Sachs stronger. A big jump on Citi on the back of numbers, 1.75% to the upside, but it was Bank of America that got the pop on numbers, and you can see more than 3.5% to the upside. We've been taking a look at the VIX and some of the moves we've seen. I mean, it has been a huge change in the fear gauge in recent weeks. You can see the spike. We've come off those levels and currently around the 30 handle. To the Asian markets, what we're seeing there in the trading session today, the Japanese stock market weaker, but that's selling eclipsed by the downside push on the Hong Kong market. Stocks there falling well over 2.5% versus modestly downbeat for China and a reversal again for the Kospi. So it's a day in the red.
Net bookings at ASML fell short of expectations in the first quarter, coming in at 3.9 billion euros. The Dutch group, which is the world's biggest supplier of chip-making equipment, they took out the word lithography. I've put it back in. Lithography, easy to say, not. Warned the US tariff announcements have increased uncertainty in the wider macro environment and clouded the outlook for the next couple of years.
Nvidia shares fell in extended trade after the chipmaker warned it will book a quarterly charge of $5.5 billion tied to exports of H20 graphics processing units to China, which were previously deemed acceptable for exports to the country. The White House said last week that Nvidia will require export licenses to sell chips to China and other specific destinations. Nvidia will report earnings later this month. Let's get to Ben Barringer, who is a global technology analyst at Quilter Cheviot. Ben, thank you very much for joining us today. I want to get into this Nvidia trade. These chips, the H20, specifically designed for the Chinese market, so not as technical, not as high quality as some of the more recent developments, but now also caught up in a trade war. What does that tell you about Nvidia's fortunes and its ability to sell to this massive market being China?
Yeah, look, I mean, the H20 is basically one of the normal, high performance chips, but they've basically stopped it having certain functionality to meet the restrictions. Now it looks like not even that's going to be sufficient for the US. I think it looks to me like it's about a $13 billion hit to revenues. So in context, they're doing just over 100 billion, something like that, a bit more than 100 billion. So that's the kind of impact. What we don't know is, this extra restriction on the H20, how much that is tied to some rules that Biden had put in, actually called the AI diffusion rules. Those were meant to try and restrict the number of countries that Nvidia could ship to, and that was going to be an even bigger potential restraint actually than this ban. So it's interesting to see what happens to whether this means that the AI diffusion rules are actually cancelled. So it's not all negative news, but obviously China has becoming a smaller and smaller part for Nvidia over the last couple of years. This hopefully puts a sort of a line underneath all of that uncertainty.
Ben, we were talking to Dan Ives yesterday from Wedbush Securities. He was saying, look, a lot of these measures are hurting US tech, not Chinese. And to that vein, what we've seen homegrown talent in China, the likes of Huawei coming up with its own chips in recent years. Is this the case as we talk about DeepSeek and the big pool of AI talent in China, that Nvidia could be more harmed here in the mix than Chinese technology and its acceleration?
Yeah, I mean, this is always the problem with these kinds of restrictions, is that you're restricting US companies from helping the Chinese, and that incentivizes them to do their own things. So you're right that Huawei and SMIC have been trying to develop their own chips, and although they're being able to do it with older technology, they're being able to produce chips, admittedly at a much lower yield. So sort of only 20% of the chips, something like that, are good chips. The other 80% has to be thrown away. But if you're trying to develop chips for AI, it doesn't matter, and you're a huge nation like China, it doesn't matter what yields you're getting. The point is you're trying to get high performance chips. So yeah, absolutely, it's incentivizing Huawei and the rest of the supply chain to build up capability. And we're even seeing that in the semi-cap equipment area as well. So that's the problem. You're incentivizing a homegrown chip base.
Yeah, and that's the point, isn't it? And I haven't read, as I know you have, I'm sure, the excellent chip wars from Chris Miller as well. I learned about the evolution of the whole sector and how the Russians were so dependent on nicking the technology, they never developed their own. I know it's a different case with the Chinese now, but the autarky that you and Karen are talking about will happen. It's happened in every other sector where we've tried to deny them technology. I'm going to ask you very bluntly, Ben, is it just dumb policy?
Yeah, I don't think it's all that smart. You're certainly you're sort of cutting off your nose to spite your face a little bit, right? You're trying to achieve some kind of short-term action, but that it sort of denies the capability and the intelligence and the intellectual property that exists within China. And we've started to see it. We mentioned ASML's results this morning. Lithography looks reasonably protected because it's probably the hardest part of the process, but you've started to see much more Chinese competition in analog semis and some power management semis and sort of the older technologies. They're certainly able to grasp that. And then in terms of semi-cap equipment, being able to do some of the slightly easier tasks in semi-cap equipment. And so yeah, it's longer term, it could backfire definitely.
And this isn't just about, again, I know from my listening and speaking to smart people like yourself, this isn't just about what the Chinese are doing in China and Americans are doing in America and these great big walls that are going to go up around the Pacific and the Atlantic. This is about setting the global architecture, setting the global rules and regulations around the world. And if the Chinese come up the rails with their own technology, if they develop this autarky that you are talking about and you and Karen mentioned as well, then they're going to be able to sell that at scale to the rest of the world, like they've done on solar, like they've done on all kinds of other technologies as well. So actually, it's the export markets eventually that the US want to dominate, could well be dominated by the Chinese. This is a natural evolution of what they're doing, isn't it?
Yeah, I think that's absolutely right. One of the things I'm watching very closely, and one of the things I think is going to be, the first countries to actually come to an agreement on tariffs with the US are Japan and Korea and potentially Taiwan as well. And those are the countries that the US is going to need as allies in this whole, war with China, the tech war with China. So, yeah, I think it's very important, in these coming months, these agreements that come with countries on tariffs, whether they side with the US, which is most probable, but there is a risk that some countries start to side with China because they see the long-term potential there. That's right.
Ben, to that point, ASML has been right in the crosshairs of chip policy from the United States in recent years, and as it holds a near monopoly on some of this manufacturing equipment, if there's pushback from the United States, is there any world that you could see where it simply does not play ball by some of the restrictions that the US is trying to impose on where it can and cannot do business?
I think we're a little early for that, candidly. I mean, they talked a lot about in their call in their statement this morning. They talked a lot about tariffs, and obviously, uncertainty is going to be one of the watchwords of Q1 results. I think the thing the CEO is most concerned about is GDP impacts from tariffs. That's, I think, very important. The ASML impacts from tariffs are widespread as well, actually. Are there going to be tariffs on systems, parts, the manufacturing they do in the US? And then, what do other countries impose as tariffs as well? So I think it's too early to sort of really comment on whether ASML chooses sides. I mean, I think a little bit like their biggest customer, TSMC, ASML just wants to support customers globally. They're everybody's production equipment. So I think we're too early for that.
Ben, I want to take you to AI because all these moving pieces around tariff policy, some have the view that the AI hype story got knocked in a very big way, and potentially the adoption as well, despite all the DeepSeek innovation. What do you think? Has AI been now pushed into the slow lane thanks to the tariff issues?
So look, actually in ASML's numbers this morning, they said that AI demand continues to remain very strong. Obviously, tomorrow morning, we've got TSMC as well, their biggest customer. So, and indications from TSMC as well are that, if you looked at their March numbers, there are 46% year-on-year growth. That's 2% faster than people were expecting. I think there's still quite good, strong demand, and demand is continuing to outstrip supply. So signs at the moment are that AI demand remains reasonably strong. There's a couple of, as I was alluding to with the tariffs, there's going to be some slowdown. The tariffs increase prices, which reduces demand. So you get demand destruction. But the other thing that's sort of in the mix and everybody's looking for is potentially there's going to be some pull forward demand as well, right? As people look to buy these things ahead of the tariff restrictions as well. So it's a very complicated setup. The commentary that we've seen from, say, ASML, TSMC, is that AI demand remains reasonably strong at the moment. But the biggest driver of tech spending is, the budgets that corporations have, right? So CTOs, CIO spendings intentions. And we've seen that start to, reduce in the last sort of 6 weeks. So, yeah, it's a very uncertain setup. I can't give you too much more clarity, but my indications so far are that AI remains reasonably strong.
Thank you for tackling the question. Ben with us, Ben Barringer, Global Technology Analyst, quoted Cheviot. Let's push on to Meta, where the CEO Mark Zuckerberg took the stand for a second day to testify in Meta's antitrust trial with the US Federal Trade Commission, or FTC. According to documents shown in court, Zuckerberg considered spinning off Instagram in 2018 amid concerns it could draw antitrust scrutiny. The FTC argues that Meta monopolizes the social networking market and shouldn't have been able to buy Instagram and WhatsApp, and is seeking to force their sale. According to the Wall Street Journal, Zuckerberg tried to settle the case last month, but his offer was not considered credible. Elsewhere, Bank of America beat analyst expectations for first quarter profit and revenue on the back of strong net interest income, which rose to $14.6 billion. The lender also said equities trading revenue climbed 17% in the quarter. Meanwhile, Citigroup also exceeded expectations, with Q1 revenue rising 3% to $21.6 billion. Equities trading revenue, well, that also topped estimates, up 23%.
Right. Let's get to this United Airlines story. It beat first quarter earnings expectations, but in an unusual move, it's not going to be unusual anymore, ladies and gentlemen, in an unusual move, issued two sets of guidance, calling the US macro environment, quote, impossible to predict with any degree of confidence. Let me just reiterate that. For a company to issue two different sets of guidance, and for a company with as many forward bookings as United has, to say the following: it is impossible to predict with any degree, not with a certain degree, with any degree of confidence. The airline said a recession could drive profits down to as low as $7 per share on an adjusted basis versus as much as $13.50, which it set in January. Karen, in a month ago, which, bear in mind, I'm not very good on my days and dates today, but I'll say at the start, I'll say mid-March.
Tuesday 4 weeks ago, or was it Wednesday 4 weeks ago?
It's still Tuesday in America land on the West Coast, so I was absolutely right. I won't take it completely wrong. So look, a month ago, I said to you, I said, wow, everyone's going, oh my God, 259 companies, the record level for years, have mentioned tariffs in their numbers. And I'm like, huh? What are the other 241 companies not spotting? Because the dumbest thing in the world is to try and give some form of forward guidance or outlook or statement without mentioning the word tariff. So while everyone was excited about the 259, I'm like, the 241, the other ones who haven't mentioned tariffs, they are not doing their job properly as well. I expect now anything less than 100% who aren't mentioning tariffs, then that company you should sell immediately. I'm not give any advice, but if they don't mention tariffs this time around, what on earth are they doing? Every single one of these companies is going to report good news, bad news, in line, whatever. That goes with the same. In fact, we know the answer. 2/3 will beat expectations because they always do. But the outlook is all that matters this time around. And none of them, given what United have just said, will honestly, hand on heart, be able to give a clear outlook.
We've criticised companies in the past for giving us very wide guidance when you can drive a truck through the numbers. But what we're talking about here is two separate sets of numbers. So I think we've come a long way, haven't we, in terms of the wildcard scenarios for investors.
It's appalling.
It's incredible, right?
Well, and it just shows you how this level the market's found now. It's calm the last couple of days, isn't it? A lot calm. You mentioned with the VIX. We're in la-la land because we just don't know.
So if we talk about what the airline's doing specifically in terms of planning for some of the scenarios, keep in mind this is an industry that was saying, look, we can't get enough aircraft. We've still got sky-high demand. We don't have enough aircraft, which is driving up prices. It is now talking about plans to cut some of its flights over summer. So the main booking window, the main travel window, it is saying is looking at cutting back on some flights because it's got disappointing domestic travel demand. Is that a red flag around US consumption? Is it going to change on a dime if tariffs get settled or there's some sort of clarity? Or is it suggesting that there's a transition in consumption habits in the US where travel as an experience is no longer wanted and there's going to be more about staples? I mean, to me, there's so many different scenarios in what that piece of information is giving us.
I'm going to let the viewers know a little secret. Not that they really care, to be honest, but I'm going to let them know. I am going to America land later in the year, and it's a personal trip. I'm not telling work.
This is the pricier international trips. They remain
that's
strong.
It. I'm not telling work about it, but I will be going to New York, but I'm not going to tell them because I don't want to go to Englewood and work. But the point being, I'm going to America, and I'm going to take in my family, and we're going to have a lovely trip. But I tell you what, the amount of people I speak to, and I'm not just talking about Canadians and Mexicans, the amount of people I say is like, oh, I wouldn't go to America at the moment. I really wouldn't go to America at the moment. Personally, I'm going to ignore the politics and I'm having a brilliant time because America is a great holiday.
It's going to be cheaper for you.
At the moment, with a pound of 132, I agree. But not cheaper because we all know New York's blimmin' expensive. But I'm going to go. But I think I'm in a minority. I know so many people, if they are making that long-haul decision at the moment, are saying we don't want to go to America. And I'm sorry, this isn't anecdotal. Take a look at any stat you want from this year about Canadian bookings, for instance, to the United States. They are down so aggressively. I personally, I'm looking forward to going to America, but I'm not going to tell the bosses I'll be in New York.
And what about the revenue side for businesses? Don't forget, a lot of business leaders would travel because they're out there seeking deals. The deals are not forthcoming and it's unavoidable because of tariffs. Then the flights are simply not going to be happening either. So we're not just talking about the leisure hit, there is a business hit as well when it comes to airlines.
Excellent point. Yeah, absolutely. And I know, I'm sure you've had the same conversations, but I've berated CEOs on and off camera who told me they would never travel as much post-COVID. I can think of one individual, and he's a very big CEO, and he said, there is no way I will be traveling a fraction. It's all changed. The world's changed. And I spoke to him very recently, and I said, you're on the plane more than you ever were. And he goes, yes, I am.
We had the same conversation about remote work, not sticking around for the long haul, didn't we?
Remote work? What's remote work? I'm sure some of our
We did suggest that once the employer was back in charge with all the chips that it would be less remote work.
Well, unless you're, of course, a UK civil servant, you all seem to be getting away with it still, don't you? You know who you are. Anyway, our US colleagues, who I won't be visiting in New York when I go over in the autumn, will be, because they're lovely and they need a break from me, we'll be speaking to the United Airlines CEO, Scott Kirby. That's today. Tune into that interview. What a fascinating interview. I will tune in as well. 12:30 British summer time. Coming up on the show, EU officials tell the US to define its position as Washington reports talks reportedly hit a major hurdle. Define their position. This is absolutely the key point. I can assure you, the European officials don't know who they're talking to and who's got the authority. Sylvia will discuss next.
You're watching Squawk Box. One of our viewers weighing in thinking you should be paid twice, Steve, because says, Steve, you need to be paid extra this week since he's working Tuesday twice. I love that.
That's very funny. I'm getting trolled left, right and centre. I shouldn't tell you, but Sylvia Mara's on set as well. Good morning, Sylvia. Who's normally just the kindest, lovely. She just came on and said, we established what day it is.
And I have pointed out that
funny,
you mentioned evening yesterday.
It's really funny.
Yeah. I think somebody needs a little bit more sleep. Well, French Prime Minister.
That's the irony. I've had loads of sleep. Just clueless on what day it was. Anyway, it's still Tuesday in San Francisco.
Right. Let's cling to that. French Prime Minister François Bayrou says the country needs to reduce its budget deficit to avoid a tsunami of destabilisation. Bayrou said US President Trump's tariff started a hurricane, saying the world is currently witnessing a reversal of alliances. The French government is aiming to cut its deficit to 5.4% of economic output this year, a first step towards meeting the EU's 3% ceiling. Treasury Secretary Scott Bessent wants a US-EU tariff deal, according to Spanish Economy Minister Carlos Cuerpo. Cuerpo, who was in Washington for talks, said the US wants to reach an agreement with its main trading partners.
I love these trade talks, and I'm going to not take all the fire from Sylvia Mara, who's going to talk about it in a minute, but Donna White, hello again.
Hello.
It's Wednesday. It's Wednesday, I'm sure it is. EU officials say they expect some US tariffs on the bloc to remain in place even after negotiations. The two sides met in DC on Tuesday. A European Commission official told CNBC, probably Sylvia, I imagine, that the EU countries continue to advocate for negotiations. Sylvia, I've read some brilliant copy on this one as well. I haven't read yours. I don't know if have you written the piece on it yet?
I haven't had the chance.
That's why I haven't read it. I knew that.
Yes.
It would be better than all the other copy in it. But I have read quite a lot of copy. And do you know what? The Europeans are clueless. And I don't mean that in a rude way. I mean that they haven't got a clue who they're supposed to be addressing, who's got the power, which policies the Americans want to keep and which they want to change, where there's wiggle room. Basically, they are surreptitiously accusing the Americans of not knowing really what their end plan is.
And so how do you work with that?
Is that what you're learning?
What I am learning is that there's frustration in Brussels. And one of the reasons behind that potential frustration is indeed because they are struggling to get hold of the US administration. It is hard to agree on new meetings, on having conversations. When they do have them, European officials express that there's been very little progress in their conversation. So I actually want to show you this quote from a European spokesperson from the European Commission, I should say. And that just really highlights where we are at this stage. The EU is doing its part. Now it's necessary for the US to define its position. Again, the Europeans highlighting, stressing that with every negotiation, this must be a two-way street. So that tells you where we are at this stage. The Europeans have had conversations with the United States earlier this week. We actually had Šefčovič having conversations with Lutnick and Greer. But ultimately, there's no resolution at this stage. The Europeans keep reiterating that what they want is a deal. They are actually pushing for a 040 reciprocal tariff deal on industrial goods. This is not a new idea, by the way. This was something that they had discussed with the US back in the day when ahead of the TTP negotiations. However, there's no feedback from the Americans as to whether they're actually willing to consider that.
This is way too rational in this type of trade negotiation. So Trump's out of the deal is maximum bravado. As reading the Chinese tactics here, it is basically when you're up close, look like you're further away. When you're further away, look like you're up close, effectively. So the tactics almost quite similar. It's about some sort of deception. The Europeans are coming at this with very frank conversations. Yeah. It feels like that is very different to what the Americans and Chinese are doing at this point.
And ultimately, there's no sign at this stage, from a practical point of view, for our audience out there, there's no signs of easing in these trade tensions between the Americans and the Europeans. We have heard from the Trump administration suggesting that pharma could be the next item under tariffs from the United States. In fact, the Europeans have said that this was expected that the investigations would start on that front. They are preparing countermeasures if that's the case. So because the Europeans don't know exactly what they're working with at this stage, they are preparing for all eventualities. They have all sorts of countermeasures and their preparation at this stage.
How many days have we got left?
But they are still pushing for a
How
deal.
many days have we got left?
You mean
84?
this week?
Very good.
It's Wednesday still, by the way.
Still.
Yeah, something around the 80 mark.
Right, 83, 84
It's
days,
some-
yeah?
yeah.
So we've got 83. How many countries has he opened a trade war with?
Yeah,
180
several.
odd. I know
Yeah.
the answer. It's 180 odd countries. So we've got 84 days. We've got 185 countries.
Yeah.
And I don't know how many negotiators Americans have got, but even the Americans haven't got enough to strike trade deals with 185 countries in 84 days.
So
what a mess.
So the Europeans stopped their tariffs on the American products as a way to tell the Americans we are ready to negotiate, but they are saying as of yesterday we will start implementing that if there's no improvement over the next couple of months.
Thank you for listening to Squawk Box Europe Express.
For more market moving news, you can head to CNBC.com.
Or join us again on the show with Steve Sedgwick, Karen Cho, and myself, Arabile Kumete, weekdays on CNBC.